So why is China disliked worldwide? It is a massive question, right? And I'm sure you've heard all the simple answers. But what if those answers are actually missing the entire point?
You know, you hear things like, oh, they're aggressive, or, well, it's a communist country. But the analysis we're digging into today says those answers, they don't even begin to scratch the surface. The real story is way more complex and, honestly, a lot harder to untangle.
You see, the core argument we're looking at isn't about some kind of intentional evil. No. It points to something it calls an unstoppable state structure. Think of it like a chain reaction, a mix of history, politics, and strategy that's created the situation we're all watching today. So let's actually break that down. To really get what China is doing today, we have to rewind the clock. It turns out there are these two incredibly powerful historical forces that are still shaping its behavior, starting with a really deep, fundamental worldview. This is the idea of Sinocentrism. Traditionally, it was a worldview that split the world into two parts, a civilized center, the Hua, and then everyone else, the Yi, on the outer periphery. Now, here's the really important part. This wasn't about modern racism. It was about order, a worldview built around the idea of who is at the center of civilization. And here's where the trouble starts. That old hierarchical worldview, it never really went away, and it crashes head-on into our modern global system, which, at least in theory, is built on the idea that every nation is equal. So while most of the world is talking about international law and equal partnership, China's actions are often seen through this other lens, one that prioritizes status, rank, and face. And, well, that can make other countries feel less like equals and more like they're just part of the periphery. Okay, the second major historical piece of the puzzle is what's known as the Century of Humiliation. And this isn't just some historical phrase, it's a period of deep collective national trauma that is absolutely essential to understanding the modern Chinese psyche. So back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, China was basically carved up and exploited by foreign powers. This experience forged this incredibly powerful national resolve: never be weak again. But this deep sense of having been a victim has a side effect. It can make it really hard to self-reflect. And it means that even legitimate criticism from the outside is often seen not as feedback, but as just another attack. So, you've got all this historical baggage. Now let's look at how that gets baked right into the modern political system, creating a structure that by its very design finds it almost impossible to ever back down. The logic here is actually pretty simple, but it is incredibly powerful. The Communist Party's legitimacy doesn't come from elections, right? It comes from delivering results, specifically economic growth and national prestige. This creates a situation where making a compromise on the world stage isn't seen as good diplomacy. At home, it's seen as weakness, a failure to defend the nation's honor. And this really gets us to the heart of the dilemma. For the government, a diplomatic concession is the same as a domestic defeat. This logic goes a long way in explaining why China so often takes such a hardline stance, even when they're in a dispute with a much smaller country. In that political calculation, retreating just isn't an option. So, this mix of historical memory and political rigidity led to some major miscalculations as China's power began to skyrocket, and that created a deep and frankly lasting divide with the West. A huge turning point was the Tiananmen Square incident back in 1989. For the West, that event burned an image into the public's mind, a government using tanks and soldiers against its own people. It created this psychological chasm that you could argue has never really been closed. And the two sides just see the event in completely different universes. The Chinese government frames it as a necessary action to stop the country from collapsing, but the West sees it as a brutal crackdown on the democratic movement. From that moment on, any criticism of China's human rights record was automatically labeled by Beijing as hostile foreign interference. All right, the next big miscalculation was on the economic front. As China transformed into the world's factory, there was this powerful expectation inside the country that, hey, surely our massive economic contributions will finally earn us the world's respect. But what actually happened was the exact opposite.
Yeah, instead of respect, what grew was frustration. The analysis points to things like forced technology transfers, widespread intellectual property theft, and competition that felt unfair because it was skewed by massive state subsidies. So what China saw as just part of its development path, other countries saw as cheating the system. And then later, this was all supercharged by the aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy under Xi Jinping, which managed to alienate even more countries.
So, all this history and these miscalculations created this tension that's been simmering for years. But the analysis we're looking at points to 3 recent, decisive actions that basically poured gasoline on the fire. They escalated simple distrust into something way more fundamental, a clash of values.
So let's quickly walk through the 3 big developments that, according to this analysis, really changed the entire game.
First up, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this started off as a welcome infrastructure project, but it's now widely criticized as a form of debt trap diplomacy. Second, you have the escalating sovereignty disputes, things like building military bases on artificial islands in the South China Sea, and the constant military pressure on Taiwan. And third, the policies directed at ethnic minorities inside China's own borders.
And the policies in Xinjiang are maybe the most serious point of friction. The Chinese government's official line is that its actions are about anti-terrorism, de-radicalization, and re-education. But much of the international community, citing a lot of evidence, expresses grave concerns about forced assimilation and even cultural genocide.
So, here's the crucial takeaway from all this. According to the analysis, these 3 buckets of issues, economic, military, and human rights, they were the tipping point. The global conversation was no longer about a difference of opinion on something like trade rules. It had become a fundamental clash of values.
And that brings us to the conclusion of the argument, which really ties all of these different threads together into a pretty powerful final summary.
And this is a really vital distinction that the analysis makes. It is so important to understand that the dislike and the distrust being talked about here is aimed at the actions of the state and its political system, not at the Chinese people themselves, who are often viewed with a great deal of admiration around the world. So, to wrap it all up, the reason China is widely disliked, according to this view, isn't some big conspiracy or simple malice. It's the predictable result of that chain reaction we talked about. A unique historical memory fuels a political system that just can't compromise, which then drives a national strategy that keeps crossing the world's red lines.
The source leaves us with this really powerful idea. China became a great power before it learned how a great power ought to behave. And this is what created that unstoppable state structure we've been exploring, which of course leads us to the final and most critical question. Can a structure that's so deeply rooted in history, in politics, and in national identity ever truly change?